Je vais faire une brève introduction et je la fais d'abord avec une double casquette. La première, c'est au nom de Paris School of Economics, dont je salue le directeur, Pierre-Yves Chauffard, qui est ici. Et je salue évidemment, au nom de l'École d'économie de Paris, tous les participants, en particulier les participants extérieurs. Donc merci d'être venu pour cette présentation de l'ouvrage de Raghuram Rajan. Alors, ma deuxième casquette, c'est directeur de la collection dans laquelle l'ouvrage de notre ami Rajan est paru, vient de paraître. Alors je vous indique d'ailleurs qu'il y a toute une série d'ouvrages qui sont à votre disposition là. Je vais en parler tout à l'heure, en particulier naturellement bien sûr celui dont nous parlons ce soir. Et je voudrais d'abord, alors en tant que directeur de la collection, je voudrais remercier les éditions Le Pommier, dont la directrice Sophie Bancard est parmi nous aussi ce soir. Merci Sophie d'avoir pris le risque d'abriter cette collection. Puisque j'en suis dans les remerciements, je voudrais remercier donc Juliette Thomas qui est actuellement dans le taxi avec Raghuram Rajan, qui a beaucoup contribué à la préparation du livre, Edith de Pontbriand et Sylvain Riffesterne qui ont préparé cette manifestation ce soir. Et aussi Gaël Giraud, donc, qui va me rejoindre à cette table tout à l'heure, qui a accepté d'être le discutant de l'ouvrage en question. Et d'ailleurs, il sera peut-être un discutant qui va discuter avant que l'on entende l'auteur, puisque nous sommes partis pour nous considérons cette hypothèse. Alors, le nom de la collection est Savoir et débats économiques. Alors pourquoi cette collection? Alors vous voyez que le titre tourne autour de deux mots, savoir d'un côté, débat de l'autre. Alors d'un côté, savoir, qui est porté en tout cas au sens strict par ceux qui savent, les savants, qui par fonction doit s'intéresser à des sujets étroits, parce que le savoir progresse toujours sur des fronts relativement étroits, c'est vrai dans nos disciplines, c'est vrai dans les disciplines des sciences de la nature, et qui, par goût, aiment aller au fond des choses. Et puis d'un autre côté, il y a le débat, et le débat public, et ceux qui y participent en général, en particulier dans notre milieu d'économistes, sont attirés par les vastes territoires, et habitués à faire entendre leurs paroles dans un certain tumulte, je dirais. Pour caricaturer encore plus, je dirais que d'un côté, il y a ceux qui savent tout sur rien, et de l'autre côté, ceux qui savent rien sur tout. Et donc, il s'agit évidemment d'une boutade, mais l'idée de cette collection, c'est effectivement de créer un espace intermédiaire, éventuellement où les deux catégories que j'ai indiquées tout à l'heure se retrouveraient, en tout cas qui donne envie à ceux dont la prudence intellectuelle est une seconde nature, je pense donc aux savants, de sortir de leur tour d'ivoire, d'entrer un peu dans l'arène et d'essayer de communiquer sans renoncer à la rigueur. Alors, vaste programme, soit dit entre nous, mais dont je crois, si je vous le présente, qu'il est susceptible d'enrichir le débat public. Et ce qui m'a conforté dans cette idée, c'est un petit peu l'expérience que j'ai acquise dans le cadre des Journées d'économie de Lyon, qui ont été créées il y a quelques années, et qui rassemblent au mois de novembre 5 à 10 000 personnes sur 3 jours, avec beaucoup de participants qui sont des économistes, et des économistes du genre de ceux auxquels je pense ce soir. Et j'ai été frappé en participant à ces journées et en aidant à leur développement par la demande qu'il y a dans le public de débat. Alors, par de débat, je veux dire non pas seulement le ronron de la pensée consensuelle, mais de vrais débats entre des gens qui ont des opinions différentes et qui sont tous informés. Et donc, il y a une demande, je crois, dans le public de débats exigeants. Et d'une certaine manière, la collection essaie de répondre un peu à cette demande en espérant qu'elle y réussira. Alors, donc, vaste programme, alors qui renvoie aussi à un large vivier potentiel. Et large vivier potentiel, en particulier, même si je me limite à la communauté des chercheurs qui sont à l'École d'économie de Paris, chercheurs de PSE, hein, où beaucoup ne participent pas au débat public et je trouve que c'est un petit peu dommage. Donc voilà pour l'appel aux bonnes volontés dans la salle éventuellement. Alors maintenant 2 mots sur la collection. L'ouvrage de Raghuram Rajan est formellement le second de la collection. Il s'appelle Au-delà de l'économie. Alors le premier, je dois vous dire, dans la collection a bénéficié d'un passe-droit. Il a bénéficié de passe-droit des très bonnes relations des auteurs avec le directeur de la collection. En effet, l'ouvrage dont il s'agit s'appelle « 2 économistes face aux enjeux climatiques » et Nick Stern et moi-même en sommes les auteurs. Donc on était un petit peu avantagés. Le troisième est sous presse, c'est un ouvrage par Roman Friedman et Michael Goldberg, hein, sur cette fois sur la théorie économique, sur les développements de la théorie économique, sur leur opinion sur ce développement, et il va paraître bientôt. Alors l'ouvrage de Rajan, Au-delà de l'économie, alors Au-delà de l'économie est une traduction discutable du titre de l'ouvrage anglais, hein, qui était Fault Lines, ligne de faille. Malheureusement, titre déjà pris en français, et d'ailleurs pas du tout par un ouvrage d'économie, mais titre déjà impossible donc. Et le fait que l'ouvrage de Rajan soit aujourd'hui ici est un peu le fruit d'un heureux hasard, hein, c'est-à-dire une proposition de traduction. Et je crois que c'est un heureux hasard parce qu'on a dit oui et parce que l'auteur est à la fois un savant respecté, hein, dans son domaine, qui est d'ailleurs le domaine de la finance, hein, qui est un domaine particulièrement sous la sellette, et aussi parce qu'il a exercé des fonctions au Fonds monétaire international, où il a bien connu François Bourguignon, qui est là, qui exerçait des fonctions parallèles à la Banque mondiale à la même époque, hein, et que ces fonctions lui ont permis de connaître, lui ont appris à connaître le monde, donc il est particulièrement bien placé, et comme vous le savez, ces avertissements sur la fragilité du système financier au milieu des années 2000 témoignent d'une très rare lucidité. Alors des fois je dis, comme vous le savez sans doute, notre profession n'a pas été extraordinairement lucide sur la fragilité du système financier qui a conduit à la crise, hein. Alors il y a toujours, évidemment, il y avait toujours une tradition hétérodoxe qui annonçait la fin du capitalisme de façon récurrente, mais avec de moins en moins de force. En dehors de cette tradition hétérodoxe, il y a, je crois, 3 personnes, c'est ce que je dis dans les dîners en ville, mais je crois que c'est relativement vrai, il y a 3 personnes qui ont prédit la crise ou qui ont mis en exergue les fragilités du système financier dans lequel nous étions. Il y avait Maurice Allais, Nouriel Roubini et Raghuram Rajan. Alors, les 2 premiers avaient la réputation de Cassandre. En particulier, c'est particulièrement vrai pour Maurice Allais. Ce n'était pas du tout le cas de Raghuram Rajan. Donc, ces avertissements relevaient d'une vraie lucidité. Hein, et c'est cette lucidité qu'on retrouve de façon assez permanente dans son livre. Hein, et j'espère que beaucoup d'entre vous, enfin beaucoup de monde, auront la chance et le plaisir de le lire. So before you came, I was just sketching the objective of the collection, Savoir et débats économiques, in which your books appear. In fact, it's the second one, since the first one was a joint book of mine on Nick Stern. That has some advantage in
climate.
On climate, yes. So the French title of your book is not the translation of the English title, okay, Fault Line. Ligne de faille would have been perfect, but was not available. Au-delà de l'économie echoes the themes you are treating, although clearly your fault lines are generated by economic forces. I also briefly stress your dual capacity as the one and as a respected scholar, and as a first-rate observer or connoisseur of the real economy. And naturally, I reminded your warning of the Jackson Hole meeting. Okay, and I argue that you were among the people who were lucid, the most lucid in some sense, the other being more or less Cassandra rather than purely lucid. So that's it's just that lucidity that the reader of your book will take advantage of. I hope there will be many. Thank you.
What I want to talk about today is certainly the thoughts in the book, but put it in perspective. I think that what we have today across the world is sort of a clash between democracy and capitalism. It's not, I mean, in general, democracy and capitalism don't need to clash. If you look around the world, there are very few successful economies based on market forces generally that aren't democratic. Even China today, which is still a relatively poor economy compared to industrial countries, is slowly feeling the pressure of democracy. And I have no doubt that by the time it becomes a rich country, it will be fully democratic. So at one level, there is a commonality between democracy and capitalism. And one could argue that the commonality is both allow actors to propose, but then it's the collective which disposes. So for example, in market economies, the entrepreneur puts a product out on the market, and the market decides whether it likes it or not. And if it doesn't like it, he goes out. It may like it for a while, and he stays with a good market with profitability, but then the market changes its mind, doesn't like it anymore, he's out. So you allow people to propose, but then the collective determines, and collective has choice. Eventually it throws the guys who don't work out. Similarly with democracy. The political entrepreneur proposes, you like him for a while, he has some interesting ideas or she has some interesting ideas, and then, doesn't seem so interesting anymore. Or the ideas stop working, or don't even work in the first place. And then you say, maybe we need change. And their stock goes down, and when the election comes, they get thrown out. So there's a commonality. But there's also a distinction between the two, in the sense that in a capitalist market system, the vote that I get to vote for your policies or your products or not depends on how rich I am. My voting power depends on how much money I have, how much property I have. In a democracy, my voting power depends on just the fact that I exist. Every individual gets, once they reach age, gets a vote. And I think that this also creates tensions between the two systems. This creates tensions. Sometimes democracy works to sort of ameliorate or to soften the worst aspects of markets, of capitalism. Sometimes it accentuates the problems, creates distortions that eventually create problems. What I want to talk about is sort of explain why one might argue that the crisis that we've had, this global crisis, was in some sense driven by the interaction between democracy and capitalism. But this time in a way that it didn't work out well. It didn't work out well. We had problems. Of course, going forward, as we solve these problems, we have to work within democracy. We have to make sure that we work it out in a way that ends up in a good place. So that's where I want to go. That's the place I want to go. In a sense, I think let's start with where we are now. Where we are now is in general across the world. We are in a situation of moderate crisis, probably not as bad as it was in 2008, 2009, but we have seen years of very slow growth. We've seen years where, in a sense, across the world, the technocrats seem to be replacing replacing the governments. I mean, what you saw last week, the Bank of Japan under Kuroda has basically determined a whole new set of policies for Japan. Of course, in Japan's case, in discussion with the government, but across the world, you see the technocrats being empowered. The central banks, in some sense, are driving many things around the world. Enormous levels of unemployment in Europe. Of course, France has very, very high levels, but also a lot of damage being done to the middle class. In the United States, through foreclosures. In Spain, significant amount of foreclosures, people being thrown out of their homes. All this is happening at the same time as when you read about BMW sales in the United States, they're hitting an all-time record. Yacht sales of fancy yachts in the Mediterranean are picking up. The 1% seem to be doing very well. And that is creating a certain amount of anger. How come the rest are not doing so well, are suffering major pain, while the 1% is doing very well? And raises questions. Are we seeing dysfunctional capitalism where the oligarchs have captured power? Has labor become powerless? Is the fact that the technocrats are making decisions and the technocrats listen to the capitalists, is it that we've sort of captured democracy? Is democracy dead? And so what I want to talk about is first push you back before the crisis. Talk a little bit about why the crisis. But then talk about the fact that the crisis has really put the elite, the 1%, the guys making above $1 million in France, it has put them in disrepute. But I think we need to be very careful about how we deal with this problem, because I would argue that the problem is not caused by the elite. The perceptions are that they've fully benefited, and they do have indeed benefited. But I don't think they've benefited because the policies have been skewed in a large way towards them. I think they've benefited because in some sense technology across the world, the nature of markets has changed to benefit the people who are now the elite. And so we have to be very careful when we change the system. We have to change it in a way that respects the need to create the kind of output, the kind of production that we need if we are to benefit everybody. But at the same time, we have to create the possibility of opportunity for those who are being left behind. We have to do both at the same time. And that is going to be very difficult. And I'm going to talk about the problems there. I'm also going to talk about potential solutions. But a lot of what I want to talk about is first how we got here. And I want to link it to, I want to go back 30, 40 years and tell us how we got here. So let me start with that and then go to what the current problems are. Where we come from, I think, is post-war growth, which was fantastic. It was fantastic in Europe. It was fantastic in the United States. The early years were difficult. Europe was in deep, destruction across Germany, across France. But the possibility of reconstruction, of building again, created a lot of job opportunities. Also, if you remember, during the Depression, trade had shut down because of protectionist policies around the world. The opening up of trade was another big force creating growth in Europe and the United States. But also, importantly, people forget that the 20s and the 30s were times of enormous new inventions. Remember, the phone. We talked today about the cell phone. What a great invention. But the phone was a much bigger invention in terms of how much of a change it made in people's lives. The cell phone is something you carry around, but the phone, you could talk across big distances, which you couldn't before. You had the phone. You had the car. The motor car was invented really in a mass market way in the 1920s. It started spreading then. Electricity. If you think about the household in those days, without a flushing toilet, without a washing machine, without a dishwasher, without even an iron, the kind of hardship that the average housewife, and they were largely housewives at that time looking after the house, had to face relative to the changes that were made in the 30s and 40s and that were rolled out in the 50s. Enormous change. So technology, which rolled out, it was interrupted by the Depression and by the war. But full electrification, full expansion of cars across the country, these took place in the 50s and the 60s, made a big change in growth. And of course, the spread of education, the movement from high school to universities, the expansion of university education. So these were all enormously important in expanding growth. And if you look at the growth numbers, in the period 1950 to 1973, Europe enjoyed perhaps the strongest growth in centuries. On average, 4.77%. The US was also growing very strongly, but the US didn't have the benefit of Reconstruction. US wasn't destroyed by the war, and as a result, didn't have the additional growth that created. Now, in this period of enormous growth, it looked like it would never end. It looked like it would never end, especially if you're going to the 60s and the early 70s. And so when economies are growing, democracy creates the impetus to spread the benefits. Sometimes it was peaceful, sometimes it was movements, as the student movement here in the late 60s, the labor movement. In the United States, you had enormous movement from the African Americans, civil rights, and you had labor movements also there. So what you had in the 60s, in this period of strong growth, was an expansion of the welfare state. Promises made across the board. Promises made expanding social security, expanding the health care, and so on. Unfortunately, these promises were made just before growth suddenly stalled. In the early 1970s, partly as a result of the oil price hike, partly as a result because of these productivity gains had all been reaped, you suddenly saw growth plunge in the US from 2.77% a year to 1.4%, in Europe from 4.77 to 2.25. Growth goes down, but you still have the promises that were made, and you somehow need to restore growth. Now, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, we had a period of very slow growth in the 70s, very high rates of inflation, very low rates of growth. This was what was called stagflation. And there was a determination to get out of this. And so you had Reagan, you had Margaret Thatcher come to power, and they focused on what was called supply-side economics. Let's deregulate. Let's deregulate all the regulation that had come in post-depression in the 30s. Let's free the markets. And once we free the markets, we will get more growth. We will get more growth because people will have the incentive to make the right decisions. There'll be lots of efficiency. Growth will happen. And that's what, to some extent, did happen. You freed up the transportation markets. In the UK, for example, as we've been reading the last few days, Margaret Thatcher took on the coal mines. She privatized many public sector entities, and it did create the impetus for growth both in the United States and the United Kingdom. In continental Europe, by contrast, the movement wasn't to break down the protections that had been built up for labor, the protections that had been built up for firms post-depression, protections limiting competition. Instead, the view, I would argue, was let's come together in a bigger Europe. And as we come in together in a bigger Europe, we will see the sources of growth here by integrating. The idea was integration would create the possibilities for growth, and of course, some nudging from Brussels to make the markets more competitive. But the idea was integration was the big factor. Deregulation was a secondary factor, and a common market was the way to grow. Now let's talk about the United States and the UK, because I think their path for growth was a little different, consisted of deregulation earlier. What that does is increased competition increases the returns to innovators, increases the returns to skill, and increases the returns to creative. If you see the United States, the 70s and the 80s is a period where entrepreneurship takes off. Self-employment takes off in a big way. The returns, the Bill Gates of the world start emerging and make a ton of money. But one place where you can see this particularly is the financial sector. There's a very nice paper by Thomas Philippon and his co-author Reshev, which this graph makes completely clear what they find. What you see on the y-axis, that is this way, is the wage in the financial sector relative to wages in the rest of the economy. Okay, what you also see plotted on the same y-axis is the relative education. So the green line is the relative amount of education for people in the financial sector. And what you see is in the period when the financial sector was booming in the 20s and just before the great crash in 29, you see that, one, people in the financial sector are much better educated than people elsewhere in the United States. Okay? They have better education. Second, they make a lot more money than people elsewhere. In other words, in the deregulated sector, which is booming, there's a lot more education, there's a lot more returns to education. It's attracting the talented people. Then what happens? In the 30s, you have a tremendous amount of regulation of the financial sector, just like today. You can't pay high bonuses, you can't have lots of activities, we're going to ring fence you, we're not going to let you do a lot. So the financial sector gets regulated, talent leaves the financial sector. If you look at the relative education in the financial sector, it comes down to the level in the rest of the economy. What happens in the early 80s? Again, deregulation takes place. Ronald Reagan is deregulating America, including the financial sector. Again, it attracts the talent and wages go up. This is a natural consequence of competition, of free markets. Whether it's good or bad, one can debate. But the point is the financial sector attracted a lot of talent from the rest of the economy as it deregulated, and that talent got paid. And it is something which you can see across the economy. People go into the software sector, make a ton of money, because the software sector is the place where there's growth and there's employment. Now, some people look at this graph and say this explains the financial crisis. There's actually a columnist at the New York Times who's made this point, and he argues what was happening in these financial firms, the Merrill Lynch's, the Goldman Sachs of the world, is during this period until the early 80s, it was the backbenchers in class, the C graders in class who went into those firms. Didn't have a lot of talent, failed every course. Now what do? Well, you know how to shake hands, you know how to play golf, and you come from a rich family, so you have good contacts. So you get hired by the financial firm and you work your way up. In the early 1980s, he says the leadership of these firms were the guys who were the C graders in class, who knew how to shake hands, who knew how to play a good game of golf. The people who, however, were starting to be recruited in the early 80s were the PhDs. The guys who did a PhD in physics and said, where can I make the most money? Well, it's not in physics. I can't make any money in physics. I'm going to go work as a trader for Merrill Lynch or Goldman Sachs, and I'm going to make a ton of money. And that's, in fact, what happened. And he says what happened was the guys on top didn't know anything, while the guys on bottom were super smart. But that's a mismatch which is problematic because these guys need to be controlled. If you don't know what you're doing, how can you control them? And that was why the whole system blew up. Now, it's a nice story. I don't think it's right because the system blew up in 2008. So the guys who came in the 80s. The PhDs had already come in and had spent 20, 25 years. The guys at the top had come in the go-go years. These were the smart guys, and yet it blew up. So I don't think that's the story, but it's consistent with this. But I told you one consequence of deregulation is that value and incomes move towards the talented. But there's something else that's happening, not just as a result of deregulation, but two other forces that are coming in over this time: technology and globalization. Now think of the average job on two dimensions. A job can be routine, a job can be non-routine. A job can be a skilled job, a job can be unskilled job. Now, most of the people in this room, which box do you fit in? Probably skilled, non-routine jobs, right? Some of you are writing your thesis, you're doing something different every day. Some of you are working as consultants, you're working with different people every day. You're doing customized work. It's not a work that can be mechanized. It's not work that can be outsourced 10,000 miles away. It's work that needs you to build relationships, that needs you to make decisions on the spot, which keep varying. Problem is, many jobs don't fit in that bucket. So take the routine but skilled job, the job that a clerk used to do. Insurance clerk, looking at the insurance form, does it fit the parameters? Can I say okay? Can I not say okay? Much of this kind of work, or the stock-taking clerk, the clerk at the end of the day goes around the store and sees how much stuff was sold, how much is left, what should I reorder. That entire job of stock-taking has been replaced by a computer, because the computer can keep tabs more accurately than this clerk, and at the end of the day can send the automated order for new stores cheaper than this clerk. Again and again, when you look at routine stuff, right? Routine skill stuff has either been automated by a computer program or it can be outsourced. Outsourced, if you have low-level legal work, which is very routine but requires legal skills, you can send it to Philippines or you can send it to India, and you have a clerk, you have a legally trained paralegal who will do it for you at 1/10 the cost it will cost you in Paris or it will cost you in New York. For the routine unskilled stuff, it has gone long ago from industrial countries. Routine unskilled stuff, a textile worker, that's the first job that goes. That's gone long ago. What is left, perhaps, is very careful, handcrafted, non-routine, moderately skilled stuff, but even that, there's pressure to send those jobs away. So what is left in industrial countries? So I said one force was deregulation, second force of technology and globalization. What that leaves is non-routine skilled stuff and non-routine unskilled stuff. Let's start with the non-routine unskilled stuff. A gardener. Very hard to automate still. You still need the gardener to dig in the right places, to put the right amount of fertilizer, to mow the lawn appropriately. So non-routine, unskilled non-routine stuff. And then you have the people like you who cannot be outsourced or automated, at least for now. So the point here then is society divides up. There's a force dividing up society into the guys at the top of the heap who are significantly more valuable in terms of the economy because they have a lot of skills, they're doing non-routine stuff, than guys at the bottom of the heap who are doing very very non-routine but unskilled stuff. There are a ton of people like that. And this creates enormous pressures on democracy. I said we will come to where the tensions come from, because in democracy, when a significant part of the population is not benefiting from the growth, from the deregulation, from the globalization, from the technology, when they're not benefiting, they demand something. They don't know what, but they demand something. This is particularly a problem in the United States. There's a book by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz of Harvard who say that business in the United States requires more and more higher order skills. But unfortunately, in the race between technology and education, education is falling behind. The technology in the United States requires people with PhDs and masters. Unfortunately, the number of people getting graduate degrees, the men getting graduate degrees, is falling both in time and relative to older cohorts. You would think that the younger cohorts, the ones who are coming into the labor force now, should be better educated. In fact, they're not. So in the race between education, that is how much education the labor force gets, and what the demands of technology are, how much education jobs need, the labor force is falling behind. So as a result, when you have very few people educated at the level that is required, their wages go up. Wages for people who know science, technology, engineering, math is going up tremendously. Wages of people who don't have a degree, a undergrad degree, who have just been educated at high school, they have been relatively stagnant. Now, of course, you want to change this. You say, we need to change this. Democracy is pushed to change this. Very hard to change the capacity of people to absorb more education in the short run. Why? According to my colleague Jim Heckman, a Nobel laureate at Chicago, basically says, by age 5, you're done. There's no way you can change your ability to absorb more education beyond age 5, because by that time you've got the nutrition that determines how good you are. You obviously have inherited your genes, but you've also inherited many of your work habits as a child. And as a result, changing around your ability to absorb, I think is a little extreme, but he says by and large, if you look at the performance of kids later on, a lot of what they become later is determined by their first 5 years. Be that as it may, the point is changing around the system so that people who are falling behind get a better education is difficult. It's very hard, it takes long, it's not going to happen in the short run. So as you see in the United States, let me not explain this chart to you, let me just, don't look at it closely. All this is saying is that wages are stagnating in the middle. They're stagnating in the middle because these are the people who used to do the routine but skilled jobs, the machinists in firms, the clerks in insurance firms, those jobs are going. Those people are being forced to join the lower middle class or even the working class, and their salaries are not just stagnating but in fact falling. So middle class wages in the United States, the median wage has been relatively stagnant, but wages at the upper end have been going up quite substantially. Why can't the middle class migrate towards the upper end rather than merging with the lower end? Because there's a big barrier, and that barrier is education. And education is not transmitting as easily to the rest that would enable them to come up. So this is one place where I would argue that, in fact, because this didn't happen, democracy tried to find other solutions. And in the United States, the other solution, as more Americans were left behind and as polarization increased, is we need to do something. Now, typically what gets done is transfers. Let's sort of tax the rich and send the money to the poor. But this is a time in the early 90s when welfare, where transfers, the US is reacting to that, is saying no more, we don't want to do it. And so what I think happened in the United States in the early 90s was credit became the vehicle to transfer from the, to transfer to the poor. So the idea was this: people care about consumption. People care about consumption, not so much about income. So if the incomes are stagnant, is there another way that they can be made to feel good? Well, what if they buy a house? And what if the house appreciates in price? And what if they can borrow against that house price appreciation? And what if they can take that money and go and buy a car or go and buy another holiday? They're going to feel good. And, you know, we can reduce some of the political pressure on us at this point. I'm not saying this kind of thing was very well thought out, but I want to say that there was enormous support for the housing boom in the United States because it alleviated a deeper problem. Deeper problem was the middle class falling behind. The middle class, in fact, rode on the housing boom. I mean, the housing credit was targeted at the lower middle class, who were the primary people affected by this. It helped them in two ways. One, it gave them a little more household wealth, which they could go out and spend. Two, it created the jobs, the unskilled jobs in construction and in related industries that had disappeared from the United States. In fact, a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago shows that if you trace the manufacturing job decline, the US has been losing jobs in manufacturing, again, because of technology, globalization, etc. That decline in manufacturing jobs was interrupted by the credit boom. Because for a while, people who were losing jobs in manufacturing got jobs in construction, in real estate brokerage, unskilled, relatively unskilled jobs which paid reasonable amounts. And it was interrupted as soon as the housing boom collapses, there's a bust, you go back to that line of decline. You go back to the manufacturing decline line. In other words, democracy interrupted the process of the middle class decline by creating a boom. The middle class benefited for a short while from the boom, but then it collapsed. One way to see this again is to look at the income gap, the gap between the 90th percentile in income and the 10th percentile in income. That's the dashed line. That's expanding tremendously in the United States. Look at the consumption gap over this time. The consumption gap is not expanding. Why is the consumption gap not expanding? Credit. Because credit is bridging the gap. Okay. Now, the point is, can we blame this on deregulation? Can we blame this on technology, on globalization? Of course, we can blame it to some extent. But those forces have also had tremendous beneficial effects. If you look at, for example, goods, the price of goods in the United States, Walmart has had a tremendous effect by sourcing around the world of bringing down the prices of those goods so that today you can buy a DVD player for $29. I mean, can you imagine buying a DVD player for $29 in the past? So a lower middle class household can have more consumption. In fact, if you look at the real consumption, it has increased for some of these households because cheap goods have gotten cheap. The point was you needed all these things. At the same time, you had to work to improve the skill base of the workforce. You didn't do that. You couldn't do that for a variety of reasons. And the pressure came to be felt in finance. Finance went on track. Of course, there were some financiers, some bankers who committed crimes. Maybe there were many. But to see the entire financial crisis as a few bad eggs is to miss the entire point. The point was this is a crisis of capitalism and democracy where the two, in some sense, did not work together in an appropriate way. Let me turn finally to the euro area and then take questions. I think the euro area had a different set of problems, not so much deregulation and inequality, but that the common market, the single market, worked for a while in creating growth, but didn't deal with the fundamental problem of insider versus outsider economies, substantial lack of labor flexibility, and so on. If you look before euro accession, many of the economies that are in trouble, Greece, Spain, and Italy, had very high levels of unemployment. They had very high levels of unemployment, suggesting that before euro accession, despite the common market for goods, there were still problems in these countries. Once you had euro accession, however, you have booms. And in 2007, unemployment has come down tremendously across these periphery countries. Where do these booms come from? They basically come, pardon the metaphor, but from each of these countries getting a credit card and being told, spend, doesn't matter, we'll take care of the bill. That's a facetious way of putting it, but Spain goes out and spends on housing, also on local governments, and creates a boom, a construction boom which employs many people, brings down the unemployment rate. Greece does a little bit of that, but does a lot more in government spending, hiring more people into the government payrolls increase. These are problems that build up because as you're hiring these people into essentially areas that are non-traded, construction is not an area where you have to be competitive with the rest of the world. Government services is not an area where you have to be competitive with the rest of the world. What happens is as these job opportunities grow, funded by a lot of government debt, bank debt, or household debt, wage competitiveness falls. unit labor costs increase, your exports start falling, you start running large current account deficits, but it's all masked by this euro area willingness to finance these deficits. And every time the euro area comes in international conferences, it says, don't worry about our country deficits. All you should care about is the euro area deficit, and the euro area is in balance, don't worry about it. But what is happening? Germany is building up huge surpluses, a lot of other countries borrowing and building up huge deficits. So look at these numbers. They're a little dated now, but Greece, 12.1% unemployment in 1999, 8.3 in 2007. Now, of course, it's above 20. And similarly for the other countries, dip after the boom and then back. Point is, the US spent its way through household debt buildup. Europe spent its way through banking debt buildup, through government debt buildup. But the underlying problem was the same. Growth fell, very hard to replace that growth. Instead, there's demand that is generated through debt-fueled spending, and that keeps growth going. So, did the capitalists do this? I would argue no. It's democracy which is responding to people falling behind and saying, we need to keep growth going. How do we keep growth going? It's populist policies which provide fast-working but unsustainable solutions. Easier credit in the US to households, government spending in a number of countries. Private financiers were not blameless. They were not victims. I don't think you should accept the fact. I mean, bankers rode the wave. Bankers paid themselves huge salaries. Lots of problems in the banking system. This is not to defend the bankers. But this is to say the problem cannot be just attributed to them. If you do that, you're missing the whole point, that this was a societal problem and we need to fix the real underlying problems in society. Now, let me just point to some issues as we fix these problems. Obviously, the underlying problems is to get growth back, sustainable growth, to get productivity back. And in this, you need to enlist the entrepreneurs who are going to create new solutions, new paths for growth. But how you get to that is also important. Who do you impose the costs on? And this is where how you impose the costs matters very much. For example, because we've come to terms with slow growth, we recognize that we come to an area of a period of slow growth when we have aging populations. They need to be paid pensions. Their healthcare needs to be taken care of. And we also have enormous levels of debt. There is a very real question, which promises are you going to give up on? Because you can't actually pay for everything. You can't pay for the promises that were made in the past. You can't pay for the pension promises that were made. You can't pay for the debt at the same time. My sense is which promises you default on will define the kind of democratic conflict or process that will take place in the years to come. If you default on the pension promises, but you uphold the debt that was issued by the state, you will be favoring the richer segments of society, the ones who own the debt. For example, in Cyprus, if you bailed out the debt holders and the deposit holders, but then said the taxpayer has to pay, that would be, in a sense, a way of penalizing the masses to favor the elite. So how the property rights will be enforced is very important. There may be situations where you're forced to enforce the debt rights because defaulting on them would be problematic. This is an issue in the United States where a number of states have made pension promises that they can never pay. They can never make the payments on the pensions they've promised the government workers. But they also have enormous amounts of debt. It may well turn out they will service the debt because they don't have easy ways to default on the debt, even while they default on the pension promises. That is going to create enormous tension because people are going to say, how can you default on pensions while you pay those rich bondholders? So I think this is something that is going to be a source of tension. We're going to see two sources of tension. One, property rights have to be violated. Whose property will be violated is a very important question. Second, people don't see opportunity. People have to start seeing opportunity once again. If they don't see opportunity, they're not going to be willing to tolerate a free enterprise system, a market-based system. And unfortunately, and this is my personal view, we need the free enterprise system, we need the market system to generate the kind of output that is needed to fulfill all the promises that were made to get us to a better future. And also, and I want to end here, Also, I think we need the free enterprise system to act as a check and balance on the government. And I want to make this last point before I conclude, that one of the problems when capitalists get delegitimized, as for example in Putin's Russia, is that an important check and balance on the government disappears. Is a check and balance because it holds a lot of wealth. That wealth is protected. It can stand up to the government. You may not have any desire to agree with his funding, but there was this billionaire in the United States, Sheldon Adelson, who lost about $50 million worth of his money funding various Republican candidates through the election. All terrible candidates, but he went funding $10 million apiece, starting with Newt Gingrich, moving on to Mitt Romney eventually. I can't visualize somebody like that in Russia today being willing to stand up to the government and funding the opposition candidate with enormous amounts of money because the billionaires are too scared that their wealth will be expropriated by the government. I think Russia is a model of what could go wrong if capitalism doesn't have legitimacy. The United States still, capitalists have legitimacy, but that legitimacy is being eroded. I think capitalists having some legitimacy is necessary to act as a check and balance on the government, to prevent the government from being authoritarian beyond a point, to create a democratic environment. That's where they work together. My fear is, in the years to come, unless we rebuild opportunity for the masses, unless we violate property rights in a way that is seen as legitimate, capitalism will lose legitimacy. The desire to tax the rich at 75% or above, the desire to remove their property through confiscation will increase. And I think that will be problematic for democracy also, because it will remove a check and balance on the government. So my hope is we can work it out. My hope is we can work it out in a way that benefits everybody, that we go back to a balance between democracy and capitalism. My fear is that we will not. Let me stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Raghuram.